Hi, I'm Emily Miller with beadshop.com. We're here today to give you a short introduction to working with seed beads. And really, this particular short is all about the beads themselves. We're not going to talk about needles, thread, or a bunch of other stuff yet. But the next couple videos coming along will absolutely show you some more of those tricks. I've been working with seed beads for more than 25 years, and I definitely started out just where you are, really not knowing a whole lot about it, but really enjoying the look of it and being pretty envious of people who know how to do bead weaving. So, bead weaving is kind of a general term that we use for making basically a fabric out of beads and thread. I know I started off really not knowing a lot and really had to stumble around. But there's so many good places to get information these days. And really, what I want to do today is get you off on the right foot with the beads themselves. So, seed beads that we work with these days are pretty much made in two countries, either in Japan or in the Czech Republic. In past times, you might have seen beads from Germany, you might have seen beads from France, you might have seen beads from even China and India. Although those two countries, China and India, don't make seed beads very much any longer. Vintage beads, though, will be very unusual, different colors that you might not see today, things like that. I really like working with Japanese and Czech primarily, and I find that their unique finishes, the stripes, the textures, all those things really fit the bill for me. Once in a great while, I'll work with a vintage bead, but one of the things you're going to learn is that seed beads really depend on how many times you can pass your needle and thread through the hole of the bead and how even they are. Japanese beads really excel at this, and the evenness of the beads really makes a big difference when you're weaving them together, and you need them to lay together like little puzzle pieces or little tiles. If I'm doing something that's dimensional, like bead crochet, or if I'm putting beads on fabric, like bead embroidery, check beads can be great because it doesn't matter so much that the evenness is so important. Although I definitely still want to know that those holes are big enough to get my needle through several times. So let me bring you down to my work surface down here and actually show you some different beads kind of side by side, which I really think is kind of the way to look at them. So in my little palette here, and this is a watercolor tray from the art supply store, I actually use these mostly for organizing, not so much for beading out of. I do find that I tend to bead on a work surface, either a padded tray or a velour kind of bead mat like this one. So I've arranged these in a bunch of different sizes and styles. And really, it's kind of amazing how many colors, textures, and finishes you can get these days. Even in just the 25 years that I've been doing it, improvements have been made, and there's a huge variety of colors and textures. So I've got working around the bottom here, got some mostly Japanese beads working all the way around, and definitely some Japanese ones over here. These are actually Czech beads. So one thing to know about seed beads is how they're sized, and I'm going to put up a chart in just a few minutes when I get done with this part. But it's interesting to note that the smaller the bead is, the larger the number gets. So if it's easier to think of these as a fraction, sometimes that makes it a little easier to kind of decipher at a moment's notice which ones we're talking about. But pretty soon, after you've worked with these beads for just a few times, you'll be very comfortable knowing which way the sizes kind of work. So these are some Japanese size 15 beads. These are Japanese 11s. These are Japanese 8s. And these are Japanese 6s. So as you can see, they're getting from smaller to larger. And you'll notice too, if you look carefully at these green ones, it's particularly easy to see that the hole is really quite large and the wall of the bead is thinner. So we call all of these beads a rocaille or a round seed bead. And that helps us differentiate between the different shapes of seed beads too, because there are some different shapes that we still consider seed beads, and sometimes they're not as even or round as you might think, even though you're looking at these and they seem very, very regular. So I made up a little sample here that I could show you where I could see each bead side by side, and we could easily see the sizes next to one another. So I'm going to start off with, at this end, some size 15 beads. So these sizing designations are kind of interesting. The way they came about was they used to size these beads by the inch. So how many of these beads laying down with the holes facing up would fit per inch. So these are the size 15 beads right here on the end. These are the silver, kind of an antique silver color. It's absolutely one of my favorite colors, and I just love how it looks. Next to it is a size 11. So the size 11 is a very common size, and it's a size that we use very often for bead weaving. It's probably the most common that you might use for bead weaving. So you'll see the largest color numbers, largest number of colors in those 11s and 15s. Although you should actually see most of these colors across the size range. So if you see it in a size 15, it's probably available in a size 11. They may not look the same though. So these beads are all made out of glass, and the glass is drawn. That means it's pulled with an air bubble in the middle that forms the hole, and then it's cut into little pieces. And so sometimes with the thickness or thinness of that glass, the light transparency coming through it will make it actually look a little different. So not every bead looks quite the same in different sizes. So next to the one thing to notice here too about these size 11s is that they are still a little bit irregular. I think you can see here on the end, this one that's closest to the 15s is actually a little thinner than the others. Okay, so Japanese beads tend to be quite even, which makes them really nice to work with. But I definitely look at the beads when I put them on a needle just before I take that stitch so that I don't have to undo. If there's a very thin one like this or a very fat one that might be bigger than that, I'll just edit it out. And I don't throw it away. I just put it to the side, and I might use it for fringe or for stringing, or if I'm making a wrap bracelet, something like that. Next to the 11s are the 8s. And again, here's this nice kind of even shape. Now, one of the things you might notice is this is losing a little bit of its roundness. So these beads feel quite round still on the outside, kind of donutish, but it's beginning to lose some of its roundness. It does have a really large hole though, so it's easy to pass my needle and thread through a whole bunch of times. As we move up to the size 6 bead, this is a bead you might use for stringing. You might use it in your wrap bracelets. You could use it for macrame. Actually, all of these beads you could use for macrame. And this hole also is getting bigger, but this bead on the outside of itself is actually getting a little rounder and a little plumper. So that's a little different from what we call a cylinder bead. And I have some cylinder beads down here at the other end because they're a little bit different animal. So cylinder beads also come under very often under trade names like Delica or Toho Treasure. And they're kind of the seed bead extreme. They have an extremely large hole and they're very squared off. So if I do peyote stitch or loom weaving with these, it really does have that kind of a tile look to it, almost like a mosaic. Again, you will see some variations in size amongst these, but it's pretty small. This guy right here near the end, he's a little bit thinner than the others. I probably wouldn't edit him out, but I would definitely go ahead and use him in the group. Now, I almost don't use these very often for fringe. They're kind of a little bit less smooth looking than round beads are in fringe. But that cylinder shape is really nice to work with. Again, that very large hole, thin wall, and kind of a flat aspect to them. This happens to be a matte finish one, but it's one of my favorites. So getting back down here, you'll notice these long cylinder beads. So these are actually called bugle beads, and they also come in a lot of variety of finishes and styles and lengths too. These happen to be Japanese bugle beads, and you'll see that they're very much related to that Delica bead. Very similar in outside diameter and inside and hole diameter. Bugle beads always have a little bit of a risk to them. They may have a little rough edge around the hole, and if you happen to notice that that's got a rough edge, don't string with it. Put it aside. It will cut your thread. Japanese beads are much more refined than the Czech beads are, and you'll see Czech beads being kind of rough around those edges in the bugle beads very often. You can buffer a bugle bead by putting a seed bead on either end of it so that your thread doesn't rub across the edge. So here's kind of a unique bead, one we don't see a whole lot. This is a hexagon bead. So it's actually hexagonal on the outside, like a stop sign. And it does have really kind of cool light reflective qualities. And I like hex beads because they have a little bit of jazziness to them. They're sparkly, but the sparkle is a little bit more subdued maybe than just a plain round bead. So all of these beads we would consider seed beads. There are some other shapes too that you're going to run into, and primarily these are Japanese beads, okay? So Japanese beads, again, larger hole, more even shape to them, and more even lengths and outside shape and diameter. So one other bead that's new to bead shop, but will soon become quite a favorite, I'm sure, are what are called Charlotte beads. So this is one color of Charlotte's, and if I turn this in the light, you'll actually see the little facets kind of pick up and sparkle a little bit. So a Charlotte bead is a bead made with one facet ground on it. So imagine having to have these beads made by machine. It used to be made by hand, but they would actually hold it up against a grinding wheel and get that one little side get to be flattened, and it really gives a real beautiful subtle sparkle to the beads. So these are often used in Native American bead weaving and in Native American bead embroidery because of that little sparkle. It's really got a little something else to it. Now I also want you to notice, since these are on a hank, which is what we call this grouping of beads all strung together. Typically that comes with about 12 strands, might be 10, but mostly 12. You'll notice as the beads sit along the string that they're quite uneven. They're very different from the Japanese beads. So these beads are shaped a little bit more like a donut or a bagel, and they have a much, much smaller hole. Here's the thread that they're on. And so I have to actually accommodate that much smaller hole and use them in a place where I'm not going to have to pass through them too many times. This is a nice turquoise one. Here's a beautiful orange. But look at those pretty sparkles. Aren't those cool? So here's a Czech 11. And this Czech 11, again, comes on a hank. And it's one way you can actually tell the difference in a size of bead or in a manufacturing of bead. The type of container or the way they come to you will be different. Most of the time, you'll get Czech beads still on the hank, and it'll just be in a Ziploc bag. But here's the size difference between that 13 Charlotte and the 8 Czech bead. Czech beads are also the only beads that come with stripes. So if you see a striped seed bead, you know right off the bat it's Czech seed bead. That little stripe is something I love a lot for bead embroidery, especially, and for bead crochet. I think it looks really amazing, and it's such a unique color combination. And there are millions of color combinations. Might be white with red stripes, might be red with white stripes. So lots and lots of choices. When you look at Czech beads, you can also might find them in vintage glass beads. So vintage glass beads will have much more irregularity to them. See, still on a hank, but it's a little hank. Much more irregularity to them. This is a Czech hexagon, and they're very uneven. So this would be something I probably wouldn't use for bead weaving, but I might use it for bead embroidery, or this was probably meant to go on a garment from the 1920s. Might have been on a handbag, but embroidered onto a beaded garment. Aren't they pretty? So here's another Czech glass bead that's also quite irregular. But this is what you might have seen, maybe from the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, that very much irregular size and shape amongst the beads, and probably a much smaller hole, okay? So a hole that doesn't accommodate quite as many passes of beads. Most of the time when I store beads, I keep them in the way that I bought them. So if I buy them on a hank, I leave them on the hank, and I try to keep the original packaging with them as well. That allows you to know where you got them from. Most of the Japanese beads that you're going to encounter are going to come in a tube. There'll be different sized tubes too. And it should say right on the tube somewhere, made in Japan. This one happens to be packed in the USA. This is a silver lined blue sapphire bead. Isn't that pretty? Here's another Czech bead, and here's another unique Czech finish. This is what's called a Picasso finish. So Picasso finishes is kind of this modeling on the outside, and it tends to make the beads look a little bit like stone. So that advantage is that we actually have this material that looks like that stone, like turquoise, but is much easier to work with and much less expensive. Again, keeping it on the hank, and if you take a moment to look at the string that's already in the beads, I can see that these have pretty good sized holes, and I know that that hole is gonna accommodate a lot of different passes through with my needle and thread. So speaking of holes, when I showed you this little sample here, these are actually all strung on 24 gauge wire, which is about half point uh, 0.5 of a millimeter, so about a half millimeter in diameter. So we can see that these all slide beautifully on that. I could actually go up a size maybe and have an even bigger wire in there. So you can actually use seed beads and wire wrapping too if you want to. So this is just a little introduction to working with seed beads, and it's a place where you can actually get some information about how seed beads are manufactured, how the sizes work, and what you might look for in buying a bead for your project. You know, when you jump into a new craft or a new project, sometimes it's very confusing. I would always say, first off, to follow the directions that the project has for you. I have lots of different projects that I've done over the years for beadshop.com. We've done bead embroidery. We've done brick stitch with beads. So this is a mixture of 6, 8, 11s, no 15s, I don't think in this one, and some bugle beads also. Size 8 uh, square stitch looks really great and makes a great bracelet. It's a good weight and easy to work with on these ones. So you can see this is a mixture of Japanese and Czech because some of these have that Picasso finish, right? So we know that that's a Czech bead. So they do match together pretty well, but you have to take care when you're doing that. This is a loom woven piece. This is all Japanese beads, and the beads are nice and even, so my rows come out nice and even looking. And in looming, that's kind of a goal. We don't really want to see a lot of texture or a lot of difference of dimension on the outside edges. We want things to look pretty smooth and even. You know, if I'm doing off loom stitches, which include things like peyote stitch, brick stitch, I want to make sure that my beads are even so that my look and pattern of my beads come out evenly. So here's one done with Japanese seed beads. This is diagonal peyote stitch. These are all projects you can still find on beadshop.com. So if you want to look them up, try using those as a keyword search. And here's a little brick stitch piece done with Delica beads. So Delica beads, again, that cylinder shape. So it's a little bit like you cut a pipe and you get that very crisp edge. So here you can see the fringe is a little bit not so fluid and smooth as I might like. So that's part of what you get when you work with cylinder beads. Okay. So our next little video will cover working with needles and threads and the tools that you might use for bead weaving. And it'll be really fun to see that you can what you can make. I do also recommend, if you want to get started with seed beads, to pick a few basic colors that you might like. You know, maybe like a white, a blue, and a black, or a white, a red, and a black, and pick a thread that doesn't really match so that you can see where your thread path is going. Keep those to set aside for when you want to practice a new stitch. It's much easier to work with beads that you're not so invested with, except for not the ones you pick for that project, but to learn on something where you can clearly see the beads and the thread path can really help a lot. So this is all I wanted to cover in this little lesson. I'll get back to you with some more, don't you worry, and you'll get to see some more fun stuff. All right. Thanks for stopping by. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.